everyone, it's Sharon Kelly from the Berwick Public Library. We have a great program for you today where we introduce you to a local artist, Thomas K. Merriam. He is a self-taught artist, and his paintings, his wood sculptures, and his sign carvings all reflect his roots as a native Mainer. Growing up in the woodlands of North Berwick and along the shoreline of York Harbor, Tom has grown to have a great appreciation for nature and wildlife and a deep love for American history, and it's all reflected in his beautiful artwork. So if you haven't seen it, do stop by the library and check it out. It's really amazing. Tom is also the president of the York Art Association. If you're an artist and looking for a place to belong, he's your man. You can talk to him. Tom's artwork will be installed through December, and again, do come by, check it out, and help me welcome Thomas K. Merriam. And thanks to BCTV for their lasting partnership in bringing all this great programming to you. Thank you.
My name is Thomas Merriam, and I'm from York, Maine. Grew up right around here. My father's side of the family was from the Berwicks. Lived on Oakwoods Road, and my grandfather had a big farm up there. And then my mother's side of the family is from York, and we moved to York when I was quite young. And so I've had a lot of exposure to the area, very familiar with all the great places to go and paint. I've been painting since I was 7 years old. My father worked at Hudsey's Manufacturing over in North Berwick, and he must have seen something in me at a young age, because he would come home with big sheets of used drafting paper and spread them out on the table in front of me, and he'd find a picture in a National Geographic and put it down and say, "Draw that picture." And he would make me draw it over and over again until I had it right, or at least he was satisfied with the way it looked. I picked up watercolor when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, and didn't know an awful lot about it, but had a lot of fun with it. And I had my first commissioned piece done when I was, I think, 7 years old. And then I had my first piece stolen at age 12, which is kind of an honor when somebody values your work enough to take a piece. It was a painting of a winter farm with 2 grouse in it. I have no idea where it went to, but somewhere somebody is probably sitting on a piece that might be worth a little something. I don't do just watercolor. I do oil, and I do acrylic, and I'm also a wood carver. My grandfather hired me when I was 12 years old to carve pieces of furniture. He retired, and he would make pine furniture, and he had asked me to carve like Indian heads or bears or eagles in benches. And I had a full-time job as a wood carver in my early 20s. I worked for a company in Portsmouth. I also worked for a company up in North Conway, New Hampshire, doing carved signs, and eventually worked my way into a full-time sign journeyman carver painter. My major in college was piano technology, and I had a piano tuning business based out of Rochester, New Hampshire, and I'm very familiar with a lot of people here in the Berwick area. I had a shop here as well, and employed people here in Berwick. I apprenticed with George Carpenter out of Perkins Cove in my early 30s, and George was the last surviving member of the Whiskey Watercolors Association. And we would go on safari all over New England. We would go up in Vermont, into the northern Vermont area during the fall and maple sugar season in the winter, and we would traverse along the coast during the warmer months and stand out on the side of the ocean and on the cliffs painting the ocean. And so I have a fondness for plein air painting. The great outdoors is a play area for me. Right now with COVID, everything is shut down. Galleries are closed and it's kind of quiet. And I had a collection of watercolor that I think looked better on the wall at the library than it did in boxes in my studio. So I have about 40 pieces here in the library. Some of them are of wildlife. There's some fish paintings, birds, insects. We have a lot of ocean paintings here, and there's a lot of farm landscapes. And let's go take a look at some of them. I would go outside at night and I would take moths off the side of the house. I had a big spotlight out there and they would gather and I would bring them into my studio. Actually, I would put them in a refrigerator first and chill them a little bit. They'd calm down. And then I'd put them on my easel and paint pictures of them. And when they'd start to flutter, I'd take them back to the refrigerator and put them in the refrigerator and cool them down a little bit, and then bring them back and paint them, and then let them go when I was finished with them. So I accrued a little collection of moths. Right here I have a rainbow smelt. This was caught out of a smelt shack up in Gardner, Maine. And it ended up being my supper, but before I consumed it for supper, I did a painting of it. This little painting right here is actually made up. I spent some time up in the Farmington, Maine area, and it reminded me of the hills up there and the rambling farmhouses. We have a lot of those around here. But this was actually a study I did for a painting that became the backdrop for Inland Fisheries and Wildlife Birds of Maine, Field and Forest poster. I had a team of horses, and their names were Clyde and Dan. They were wonderful horses, and I pulled a lot of logs with them. And this was an imaginary painting of what I would have thought my grandfather's farm looked like. This was indicative of my grandfather's farm. He had a long road, a long driveway going into his house. It was like a mile long. And I imagine during mud season, he had to pull his truck through that a few times with his team of horses. He was up on Oak Woods Road in North Berwick. These are known as whiskey watercolors. Years ago, the old-timers didn't have colored photography, if they had photography at all. The Whiskey Watercolors Association was a very old association of painters. They would go together, oftentimes as groups, out to paint on the side of a hill or wherever they would go. And they painted in the winter, and they would use whiskey or white wine to wash their brushes in because it wouldn't freeze. And they would paint small, and this was their colored photograph. They would take it back to their studio and then paint it large. It was considered showing off if you stood on the side of a hill with a giant piece of paper and painting. It was more modest to paint it small and then do it in your studio later. So this is York Ledge 1. I used to go out there in a small boat when I was younger and fish for codfish, when you could still do that. Late May and early June, they would run up around this ledge, which you can actually see from the mainland. It's about a mile out. There's a spike coming out of a rock out there. And I often imagine the old mackerel seiners and the fishermen that would run the trot lines coming into York Harbor and leaving York Harbor in these little schooners. Normally what I do is I start with a wash of Naples yellow to activate the paper. and then build on it. I will start with a very, very light sketch, maybe use a number 4 pencil to give myself a kind of an idea of where I'm going and the composition of it. And then the rest of it is just experience that I'm putting in here. I've spent a lot of time in these places, and this is all by memory, something that I've seen in the past, and weaving the shadows into the mast and the froth around the front of the boat as it passes by York Ledge 1. And then I keep building and building on this until I get it where I want. And watercolor will dry, but it'll dry light, and so you can't like trust it. You have to kind of go back over it and back over it and back over it until you get it where you want. And sometimes if you keep going, you can kill the painting. But I was trying to catch a mood here. We're looking kind of southeast, and the sun would be setting off to the right-hand side of the painting. These boats are heading home, so I wanted to have the water kind of dark with maybe the sun just catching the tops of things. I like doing these little ocean scenes. I've got one down here. It's really small. It's actually something that I saw off Boone Island, and this is the shark fishermen. And you'll see these boats down in York Harbor with the catwalks coming off the front. And the man would stand up there with a spear, commonly looking for tiger sharks. At my last house, we had an apple tree behind the back porch, and in the wintertime, the birds would alight there, and I caught this blue jay one morning sitting out there basking in the sun, waiting for me to come out and fill the sunflower feeder. I love birds. I've loved them ever since I was small. I really get a charge out of painting them. I've done them professionally, and then Fisheries and Wildlife has hired me to do bird paintings, and I've done a lot of illustrations for them. I am responsible for the Maine Wildlife license plate, the Support Wildlife license plate, which has the moose on it. It'd be fun to talk a little bit about that. That was a process that took about 7 years. When we had the lobster plate years ago, nobody wanted it because they couldn't tell what it was. So they started buying the new loon plate, which was a conservation plate. Most of the money went to IF&W for conservation projects, research of endangered species. Some of it went to the conservation department for maintaining parks. And so when they came out with the new chickadee license plate, they started losing money right away because those loon plates weren't needed anymore. We had this cute little chickadee, and they went, I think, about 10 years, and a lot of these programs had to shut down because there was no funding for them. So, you know, I pitched that we need to have another license plate that can go back to support those programs, and so they agreed. And over the course of 7 years and many, many designs, we came up with the one that we have. It became very political. It was kind of funny. We started out with just a lynx. We had puffins. We had eagles, a very successful program that was initiated by the sale of licenses, and eagles were taken off the endangered species list a few years ago. Anyway, it ended up with the brook trout, the moose, and if anybody wants to know, that is Mount Katahdin in the background behind the main license plate tag. And Trout Unlimited kicked in for the license plate to be printed. The Moose Lottery paid for the license plate to be printed. And Commissioner Martin, who was the commissioner at the time that this was put together, was from the county, and that's why we have Mount Katahdin in the background. I'm fascinated by trains, especially old trains, steam trains. Powerful, that belching steam and smoke, and I was impressed with the men that worked the rails. And this is one of my favorite paintings here, this old steam engine crossing the trestle. I'm very impressed with that men would go to sea with harpoons and they didn't know how to swim and throw them into whales and then hang on for dear life. So I'm very much into getting the essence of the power behind the image. Well, I paint when I get a break from life. I have to be inspired by something that I saw. Oftentimes you might ask the question, what was it that I saw? I go around the bend and just the way the light hits the side of a building, or something that inspired me through history. Behind me I have a painting of the fishermen leaving to go out and run a trot line. This was something that I found in a photograph at the State Library. I pulled it out of the archives, and I just thought it needed to be documented in a painting. I travel around and I'm looking for things to stop and paint, and if I see something I'll jump out and go to the nearest house and ask permission to sit there and paint. Oftentimes it's just something that's running through my head that I saw somewhere, somehow, or imagined, and I paint it. This painting behind me is of a Minuteman, and I thought he was quite handsome. I was thinking about Minutemen. I run a fife and drum corps, and so I painted him up. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get a chance to come into the Berwick Public Library and view some of my work.